This is Michael Krasny, and this is Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another episode. In this episode, we focus our attention on the ongoing crisis and tragedy in the Middle East and the war that has broken out and is ongoing between Hamas and Israel following a bloody and deadly attack by air, sea, and land last Saturday by members of Gaza-based Hamas, designated by the United States and the European Union as a terrorist group. It was a killing and abducting attack into the southern region of Israel across the border from Gaza. In this episode, we're going to discuss the ongoing crisis and its many dimensions with Amichai Magen, PhD, who is visiting professor at Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. He also heads the MA program in Diplomacy and Conflict Studies and heads the program on Democratic Resilience and Development at Reichman University's Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy. And he is author of Towards a Comprehensive Security Approach in the Middle East and Lessons from the European Experience in Justice and Home Affairs Cooperation. And I welcome Amichai Magen.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be with you. I wish it was under happier circumstances, but I'm a great admirer of your work.
Thank you for that. I, too, wish it were under better circumstances. And, well, we can just talk about where we are and where this is all headed. It is grim. It is dark. It is very upsetting, I think, to both sides. Many moving pieces. I would recommend initially the article that you did, which I thought was excellent in Persuasion, called This Was Never Supposed to Happen. And you call it Israel's Civic Yom Kippur because in the Yom Kippur War of many years ago now, there were no civilians that were killed, no civilians who were abducted. So this is an entirely different kind of war. It's also a war that bears out terrible failing of security, and I want to get to that right away with you because Mossad and Shin Bet were supposed to be almost invincible. Maybe there was too much complacency. Certainly, there were too many resources in the West Bank, and there were sensors and tech equipment that was really undermined and set in the direction away from of efficacy. But how much was the weakness that was perceived by Hamas because of internal political division part of this?
It was certainly part of this, Michael. As you know, over the last year, Israel was polarized to an extraordinary degree. We tend to have a sense of Israel as being a very powerful state, very cohesive, a state that watches its enemies very carefully. But Israel's enemies also watch Israel very carefully, and they detected division and weakness and distraction and a kind of loss of trust by the Israeli population and the Israeli government. And that created an opportunity for them, which they tragically exploited, right? When we think about power and how what makes a country and a society powerful, we tend to emphasize the technological capabilities, the military capabilities, but fundamentally power is also about spirit and it's about cohesion. We see that in Ukraine. We see that countries that have cohesion and spirit and unity are able to fend off much more powerful adversaries, whereas powerful countries that lose that sense of cohesion can appear very, very vulnerable. That is certainly a factor here, but it's not the only factor. In other respects, this was a failure of imagination. It was a colossal intelligence blunder followed by colossal operational blunder. For all the reasons that you've identified, Michael, the Hamas, probably with the assistance of Iran, has been planning this for a long time. Israel didn't discover the plot in time. Hamas has been instigating trouble in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and so Israel concentrated many of its regular forces in those parts of the country, leaving the south more vulnerable. And this was also a failure of imagination in the sense that Israel has become too reliant on technology, and it believed that the Iron Dome system and other technological systems would be able to protect it. But we discovered that we were vulnerable elsewhere.
It's just come out recently, though, that someone from Egypt's intelligence had warned Israel, and I guess they passed on that, or they didn't at least respond to it the way perhaps they should have. And there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal that pointed out that Iran definitely was involved in the attack, even though the United States and Secretary Blinken have said there are no real fingerprints that seem to point to Iran. The United States wants clearly to establish better relations with Iran and renew the anti-nuclear treaty. And also, to some extent, there may have been a catalyst for Hamas because of the unfreezing of Iranian dollars and the freedom that was extended to American prisoners who are being held by Iran. I mean, right now we have a situation, I'd like your thoughts on this, where you have all of these hostages, and these hostages to be separated from Hamas is very difficult. They're being held as shields probably. They're being held in secretive places. Who knows where they are, in tunnels or whatever. It's very difficult to get intelligence on that. And there's also the challenge of separating the civilians in this very packed place of Gaza from the terrorists. And they are terrorists. I mean, they're being seen as heroes and all of that, but, you know, we're talking about decapitating babies and raping women and murderous assaults and so forth. So there are many people in Gaza who would love to find a way out of Gaza. They can't protest. They can't do anything. They're trapped. And the hostages are trapped. I don't know at this point if you can see any light in all of this or any daybreak.
They're trapped as part of a deliberate and frankly evil strategy by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, two proxies of Iran that have seized control of Gaza in 2006, and for the last 18 years are essentially holding what is now a population of 2.3 million people effectively hostage, using them as slave labor, using them as human shields, and cynically manipulating the care that Israel has and the broader world has for humanitarian concerns for Gaza, manipulating that cynically and systematically for their own goals, which is to wage jihad on Israel. I do invite anybody who's listening to us to go to their favorite browser and just enter the words Hamas Charter, and you'll be able to find an English translation that lays out Hamas's constitution and sets out its goals. Michael, I think it's really important to understand deeply the ideology and the goals of Hamas. Hamas is actually an acronym. It's not an acronym. It's an acronym. We wish it was an acronym. It's an acronym for the Islamic resistance movement, in Arabic, the Muqawama. It is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and its declared goal is to conduct genocide upon Israel and to build a fundamentalist Islamic caliphate on the ruins of the state of Israel. That is the goal, and everything else, including Palestinian civilians, is secondary to that, and it's an instrument in the hands of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in pursuit of their goal. When I was talking about the failure of imagination on the part of Israel, there's also an issue of naivety here, because over the last 3 years in particular, Israel believed that it could reach a modus vivendi with Hamas. Israel believed that by funneling more money into Gaza, most of it coming from Qatar, by providing more working permits to allow Gazans to work inside Israel, Israel was buying stability and peace and improving the economic situation within Gaza. One of the great tragedies of the last few days is that conception, that notion that we could reach some kind of accommodation and that we could try to improve the situation by offering incentives to Hamas. That has been shot out of the water, and that leaves us in a very sad and desperate place.
Well, originally in the charter that Hamas put forward was the destruction of the state of Israel, and now Israel is saying they want to destroy Hamas. Now, there may be in Israel a sense of wanting to destroy Hamas, particularly given the attack that occurred in the southern part of Israel, but there's some serious and profound difficulties that are raised in that whole notion. Now, they've codified that to some extent. They've said destroy the military installations and so forth. But nevertheless, I think the sentiment now is to want to probably destroy Hamas. And people in Gaza are suffering. I mean, there's no electricity in the hospitals. It's going to be a graveyard. There's food is being kept out. Fuel is being kept out. And the civilians who are under the thumb, as you put it, of Hamas are the ones who are being hurt and victimized by this to a great and profound degree. What can be done about that? I mean, could Egypt, for example, let some of these civilians go through? And in the past, they haven't wanted them, and presumably that's not going to change. But what is the alternative for them? What kind of hope is there for them, if any?
Yeah, so the situation at the moment is that Israel has stopped providing electricity to Gaza. It has not stopped allowing humanitarian aid to come through the border. There is dialogue with the Egyptians to make sure that necessary humanitarian assistance goes through the border. And with regards to the water situation,
there's a lot less food getting through. There's a lot less staples and essentials getting through.
Sure, we're in the midst of battle, and so tragically that has dire consequences. Gaza, of course, borders two countries, and that is Israel, but also Egypt. And there is a large opening, a border crossing between Gaza and Egypt in Rafah, in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. So we'll have to see what the Egyptians do. Clearly, as the pressure on the population in Gaza increases, and Israel did announce about 12 hours ago that the people living in the northern part of the Gaza Strip should be making their way to the southern part of the Gaza Strip so that Israel would not harm civilians as part of its forthcoming military incursion into Gaza, which seems to have just started.
But they're destroying neighborhoods, and people who are completely innocent and don't care for Hamas are seeing their neighborhoods annihilated. And there's nowhere for many of these people to go, is there?
It's a very difficult situation, Michael. But again, what is Israel to do? Hamas has turned Gaza into a giant terrorist camp on ground, underground. They've hidden tens of thousands of rockets and missiles inside schools and kindergartens and mosques, underground, within hospitals. Hamas is using United Nations facilities that are there to assist the civilian population as basis from which to launch attacks indiscriminately onto Israeli civilian population centers. So Israel has no choice. It has to defend itself, and it has to go into Gaza and to try to dismantle those capabilities. That clearly has a cost, but Israel will do everything that it can to minimize that, which is its duty under international humanitarian law.
We have a humanitarian crisis nonetheless, though. I mean, it's not like what we see in Yemen yet, but it could be along those lines. And what about Iran's role in all this? I mean, as I said, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal which showed that Iran really did have a much more integral role than has been assumed. And Israel perhaps learned a lesson when Hezbollah went against them on the Lebanese border. It proved to be futile to a great degree. In fact, the Wall Street Journal article says they're being maybe dragged into this so that they can be in a quagmire and so that more hostages can be taken from the Israeli IDF soldiers, which is certainly a plausible, where Hamas is concerned, scenario.
The Iranian role is absolutely critical here. And this is something that I think many times people don't connect the dots and don't really understand. This conflict, fundamentally, Michael, is not a Hamas-Israel war. It is a war an ongoing war waged by Iran, mostly in the shadows, but sometimes explicitly, using proxies against Israel. From an Iranian point of view, Gaza is a base for two of its proxies, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to wage war against Israel and to put pressure on Israel. But Iran also has a very, very powerful northern proxy, that is Hezbollah, based in Lebanon. Iran has various Shia militias based in Syria and Iraq and Yemen. And so we need to understand the context. And you mentioned Saudi Arabia and the United States. This is really critical. The nature of proxy war is such that plausible deniability is central to it. And Iran is very savvy, very sophisticated in waging proxy war. And we don't yet know the extent of Iranian involvement. But what we do know is that Iran has right now a strategic goal and a strategic imperative, in fact, two strategic goals. One is to try to ensure that they scupper the efforts to establish a Saudi, U.S.-Israel peace deal, and more importantly, from an Iranian point of view, a Saudi-American defense pact. That is something that the Iranians are trying to frustrate. But there's a second goal as well. Remember that Iran has already enriched uranium to over 60%. American officials, Israeli officials realized that Iran is within 2 or 3 months of breakaway nuclear capacity. Perhaps the current crisis is one that Iran is trying to instigate in order to be able to rush forward and cross the nuclear threshold, which is a strategic goal of the Ayatollahs in Iran. And from their point of view, existential. It will allow them to remain in power in Iran and to dominate the region. So there are certainly overwhelming strategic imperatives from an Iranian point of view to try to sow chaos in the Middle East.
And the possibility of ending the diplomacy or aborting it with respect to Saudi Arabia and the United States seems imminent now. And possibly even the Abraham Accords are endangered now because of what's going on. Plus, you could see the possibility of all of these forces coming together, the Houthis from Yemen, the Hezbollah from Iran, Syria, and so forth, in a united front against Israel. And how much backing can Israel get other than the United States? President Biden has said, we've got your back, and yet we're fighting to get aid to Ukraine. We're fighting to get aid even to Israel now because our own Congress is in such deep division, polarization, whatever word you want to. Anyway, we're going to continue this discussion, but I also want to invite those of you who have comments or thoughts or questions to please feel free to be part of the program that's live now. It'll be, again, available on in the future on Apple Podcasts and on a number of other podcasts, including our own, Spotify and so forth. This is a question from Reed, who says, Hamas's actions were horrendous. Must Israel respond with equally horrendous actions? It may fulfill the desire for vengeance, but how can it help Israel and Israel's cause in the eyes of the world community? It's a really important question because there's always been restraint. Israel's always been told to restrain whenever they struck back in a retaliatory way, and Israel's never been hit this hard. And so restraint is not exactly on their minds, and you can't, or on their hearts, presumably. But as soon as the smoke clears, there's going to be an accounting and fingers pointing at Israel. And we're at a status now of rising anti-Semitism in the world anyway. So that's just going to get worse, isn't it?
Michael, there's no moral equivalence between Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad on one hand and the State of Israel on the other. We need to be unequivocal about that. On the one hand, you have groups that are using a captive civilian population as human shields to target innocent civilians in Israel. in the most cynical, horrific way. And we've just received a demonstration this Saturday of what would happen if, heaven forbid, Israel was ever overrun by groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It was a pogrom. It was a massacre. I don't want to get into graphic details, but we can use our imaginations and understand what could happen in Israel, a second Holocaust, if these groups were ever powerful enough to implement their genocidal game plan. And on the other hand, you have a country, the state of Israel, that could face within hours 5 or 6 or 7 different fronts, that is trying to protect its civilian population, and that is compelled to take decisive military action, because if it doesn't, it will seem more vulnerable, and that will attract more violence against it. So that's the equation. Imagine a situation where a radical jihadist organization has taken over San Francisco, taken over San Jose, holding hundreds of thousands of people captives. In the case of Gaza, it's 2.3 million human beings, and is using that territory to dig tunnels, to develop missiles and rockets. They're assisted by Iran, and they are shelling and bombing innocent civilians living in Cupertino or Mountain View or Palo Alto. I mean, that is the reality of the situation. What would you do? What would you do? It's very fraught. It's very difficult, and there are no easy answers here. But certainly, I think we can all understand that there's zero moral equivalence between these actors.
And a question from Bill in Austin, Texas, who wants to know, is there a possibility that Israel will push everyone from Gaza into Egypt and raise the entire strip?
No. What will happen, to the extent that we can foresee, which is difficult, is that Israel will issue warnings to the civilian population in Gaza in specific areas, as is its duty under international humanitarian law. Israel will try everything it can to minimize civilian casualties and damage in Gaza. Israel is not waging a war against the population in Gaza. Despite the fact that the blood is boiling, Israel is not seeking revenge. Israel is seeking to degrade and destroy the military capabilities of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so what it will do is to ask the population, to warn the population to clear out of certain specified regions in Gaza, to move through humanitarian corridors to other parts of Gaza until Israel can clear and secure a certain part of Gaza. And then it will allow the population to go back. It will allow humanitarian aid to come in, and once the population is cleared from areas that are still controlled by Hamas, Israel will presumably take action in those parts. We're yet to see what Egypt is going to do. I think there's going to be mounting pressure on Egypt to participate in the management of this situation. In the past, the Egyptians have played a very important role in managing these types of situations, and also trying to negotiate a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. And I think we're going to see more of those efforts in the coming days and weeks.
Egypt also has a population that's really very sympathetic to the Palestinians. Whatever accord they have with Israel is certainly endangered by that, isn't it?
No, not at all. Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Sisi and the entire ruling class of Egypt are absolutely terrified of the Muslim Brotherhood undermining stability in Egypt. Let me remind you that in 2012, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power in Egypt under President Morsi. There was then a coup against them in Egypt. And so Egypt is deeply interested in Israel taking decisive action against the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. That is also the case for Saudi Arabia. That is also the case for Jordan, whose own stability is being undermined by the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, Michael, going back to your earlier point, what we really are seeing happening now is a struggle between an Iranian-led axis of chaos, what is called the axis of resistance, the Mukawama, and pragmatic Sunni Arab states that have built relationships with Israel, with the United States, with Europe, and there's a struggle over the future of the Middle East. Are we going to live in a Middle East of nation states that respect national borders, that respect the basic principles of international humanitarian law, or are we going to see a Middle East that is awash in atrocities and violence, which is what Iran and its proxies want to see? That is fundamentally what is at issue here.
Well, I think you're right about the animus that exists from the Egyptian government toward the Muslim Brotherhood and toward the jihadists. But nevertheless, that government was essentially displaced democratically by the Muslim Brotherhood. And there is a great deal of, seems to me, what they talk about in the street in Cairo and in Alexandria in Egypt, sentiments that are in the street are very pro-Palestinian and probably much more allied with Hamas than the government may be allied with Hamas. I just want to make that distinction because I think it's real. But I've got another question from Jerry in Aurora, Colorado, who says, Israel has in-country support, as we have seen in Iran with the killings of some of Iran's nuclear scientists. Does Israel have that same level of in-country support in Gaza?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you mean by in-country support?
Well, I suspect what he means, I'm interpreting subtext here, is Israel has operatives. Israel has intelligence and those who are operating like in the series Fauda, for those who followed Fauda in the episodes on television. In other words, Israel was able to kill Iranian nuclear scientists. Do they have that same capability in Gaza where Hamas is concerned? Do they have operatives or... I'm assuming that's what the import of the question is.
Okay, I mean, the answer is I don't know. And if I did know, I wouldn't be able to tell you. There's a distinction here that I think the caller is making between what we call SIGINT, or signal intelligence, which is technology-driven intelligence gathering, and what is called HUMINT, or human gathered intelligence. And I guess he's referring to the latter. Yes, I mean, historically, Israel, whether it's the IDF or the General Security Service, has human intelligence capabilities around the region, including in Gaza, which only makes the intelligence failure of the past few days even more stark. It's astonishing to me, Michael, that Hamas was able to organize this over the course of many months without leaks, without Israel learning about it. How much was known or unknown, whether Abbas Kamal, the Egyptian minister of the intelligence services, warned Israel or not, as has been reported, we'll only know once a commission of inquiry is established in Israel to investigate the failures of intelligence and the subsequent operational failures. But that will happen after the war. But it will happen. We will know.
I was just about to ask you, Amichai, about whether or not, well, for one thing, this government that's been formed, this unified government, supposedly, with Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, can really sustain and stay on top of things. But also, when an investigation takes place, there's a lot of finger pointing at Netanyahu and suggestion that he's responsible for a lot of the failures of intelligence, emphasizing too much what was going on in the West Bank and not giving enough attention to Gaza, and all kinds of failures that have been put at his, well, like I said, he's being seen as culpable in many ways. But he's still in charge. He's still the head of state. I mean, it's a unified government with the former Secretary of Defense and leader Benny Gantz, but can this stay unified?
Well, he's still in charge. He's the prime minister. The government is functioning. as long as Israel is in this immediate emergency, all hands will be on deck. Israelis will unite. They will rally. Civil society will rally behind the leadership. But certainly, everybody's aware that a political reckoning is coming. I just saw a public opinion poll that was published in Israel yesterday, where a staggering 86% of the respondents laid the blame for this at the feet of the government and the head of the government, Benjamin Netanyahu. And that includes 79%, a staggering 79% of the people who identified themselves as having voted for the various political parties that make up the current coalition. That is stark condemnation and attribution of responsibility. So I have no doubt that we may very well be on the cusp of a realignment of Israeli politics in the aftermath of this horrific shock, as happened after the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago.
Is there any possibility or any glimmer that what has been certainly backed by many here in the United States and in Europe as a two-state solution would even be possible? I mean, the Palestinian Authority or the West Bank operates under a very different kind of system, to be sure, and is almost a separate sovereign state in many ways. But at this point, is that just dead in the water?
Well, while the guns are blasting and we have this level of violence and chaos, nobody will be thinking about immediate political concessions or political solutions. But, Michael, there are important silver linings, if we can call them that, under these tragic circumstances, that we should really be aware of. One of the key impediments, arguably the key impediment, to making meaningful progress in Israeli-Palestinian peace building, not Arab-Israeli peace building, because that's been going on very well over the last few years, but specifically Israeli-Palestinian peace building, is this separation, this rift, where Gaza is controlled by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the West Bank is controlled by the Palestinian Authority that is based in Ramallah. As long as Hamas is in control of Gaza, that rift makes making meaningful progress towards peace virtually impossible. So in a way, removing Hamas's control of Gaza opens the door on the possibility of a restoration of some kind of unified Palestinian leadership that is able to assume responsibility for Gaza. And that will allow us to make meaningful progress going forward. But I think there's a second and ultimately more important dynamic that we should be aware of. As we've discussed, Egypt is terrified of Hamas. Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, is terrified of Hamas and other Muslim Brotherhood movements that are undermining stability in Jordan. Saudi Arabia has a vested interest in stability, the UAE, Bahrain, and so on and so forth. What we may be seeing, not out of Arab love for Israel, the Arabs haven't become Zionists, but the Arabs are terrified, and they will now be even more terrified of Iranian dominance and aggression, which creates a very powerful motivation for the Arab states to very quickly restore ties with Israel and to try to move forward in building the regional infrastructure that would create the conditions under which we may be able to make meaningful progress in Israeli-Palestinian relations. That may involve a greater role for Egypt and Gaza. That may involve a greater role for Jordan and Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis Palestinians in the West Bank. But I think that at a strategic level, everybody in the region will be jolted by fear from Iran and what Iran is trying to do in the region at the moment. And that is something that American diplomacy will have to utilize and will have to build on over the coming months and years.
You would think that Hamas would be more allied with ISIS than with Iran. And I'm not only talking about the Sunni-Shia split, I'm also talking about the plain and conspicuous fact that in many respects, I mean, Hamas has been operating like ISIS. A lot of their behavior certainly mirrors what ISIS has done in terms of the just sheer barbaric nature of it. And I wonder at this point if Hamas, if they can't rally Egypt and the Hashemite kingdom to their side, because of the Abraham Accords, the Abrahamic Accords, they can't rally those nations. What about the Palestinians who live within Israel? And what about the Palestinians who are in the West Bank? I mean, do they have at least more of a kind of pull in brotherhood with Hamas that Hamas can acceptably lean on, so to speak?
Well, an integral part of Hamas's strategy, and it's ongoing through social media, through claims that the Al Aqsa Mosque is in danger. That is an integral part of Hamas's strategy. Hamas is constantly trying to incite violence in Jerusalem, the West Bank, within Israel. Very interestingly, over the last 48 hours, Palestinian Islamic Jihad has declared a day of global rage, of global jihad. So PIJ and Hamas are trying to link their cause, their local cause in Gaza, with the broader global cause of global jihad. And that is certainly part of their strategy. Most of the time, for most Palestinian Arabs, and even more so for Arab Israelis, that is not successful. And by the way, Michael, when Hamas went on its slaughter campaign on Saturday, they didn't distinguish between Jews and Arabs. There are dozens and dozens of Israeli Arabs who were murdered by Hamas and PIJ terrorists as they conducted their campaign of slaughter inside Israel. So, and Israeli Arabs are aware of that. Israeli Arabs are shocked and horrified by this behavior, just as much as anybody else.
And a question comes to us from Tommy in St. Paul, Minnesota, who wants to know who else or what else is funding Hamas and how can that be addressed?
So Hamas receives large sums of money directly from Iran,
and from Qatar as well,
and from Qatar. An estimated $1.5 billion over the last 5 to 7 years has been funneled from Qatar to Hamas. But Hamas is, like Hezbollah, a hybrid terrorist organization with a sophisticated regional and global network of activity, including financial activity. And so there are NGOs, there are so-called Dawah charities that raise money for Hamas all across the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, and beyond. And part of the struggle against global jihad, part of the struggle against organizations like ISIS or Boko Haram, or Ansar Bet el-Maqdis, or indeed Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, is the illicit sources of finance, and increasingly crypto, that is being funneled to these organizations.
Let me get back, if I may, to the hostages, because in some ways, of course, Hamas has said they had vowed to kill them, and one could assume that they'd use them as shields or they become collateral damage and all of that. I hate to talk about this so clinically because, you know, we're talking about human lives and the vulnerability of real people. But I wonder if the hostages were initially taken essentially to be traded for Palestinian terrorists who were being held in Israel. I mean, there was one IDF fighter who was traded for 1,000, as I'm sure you're well aware, and many of our listeners, I hope, are aware, one Jewish life for 1,000 lives of Palestinians. This is essentially bargaining chips that they are holding, and that they want. In fact, we mentioned Qatar, the leader of the Palestinians who spent 20 years in an Israeli jail, wants all of these brothers of his released, and understand that that's behind a lot of this hostage taking. So what do you see at this point as being realistically the likelihood of the fate of these hostages, or how they'll be used, or to what extent they'll be used?
There is no doubt that perhaps the most important strategic goal that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad sought to achieve in this operation is to kidnap Israeli soldiers and civilians and take them back into Gaza. And that serves three main purposes. One is human shields. So having those hostages, they believe, reduces the possibility of Israeli incursions, or at least will make Israel more cautious. I'm not sure if that is true. I think Israel doesn't really distinguish between the civilian lives of Gazans and those of Israelis who have been kidnapped. These are all innocent civilian lives. Secondly, as you say, Michael, clearly Israel is very, very sensitive to this, and in Jewish tradition, the notion of pidyon shvuim, the notion of a duty to release people who have been kidnapped, taken into captivity, is very deep rooted in Jewish tradition, and Hamas knows that, and so they certainly banked on capturing captives and using them to bargain. I think they were amazed by the degree of success that they had. They probably counted on perhaps capturing 5 or 10 or at most 20 Israeli soldiers and taking them back into Gaza. They ended up, because of Israel's failure, capturing up to 150 people, including a 6-month-old baby, including a Holocaust survivor, an octogenarian Holocaust survivor, including 13 French citizens, 10 or 12 Italian citizens, American citizens. So they captured more people than they expected. And lastly, one of the key goals for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad is to make the trade that you've described, Michael, and try to get Israel to release convicted terrorists that Israel holds in its prisons, and to achieve that huge boost for Hamas and for jihadist organizations all around the world. Look what we've managed to do. We've managed to get Israel to release thousands of terrorists in return for 100 or 150 captives. So that is certainly a central part of their strategy.
It also occurs to me, Amichai, that Israel can do a great deal of damage in Gaza, but it's not able, and we learned this as a big lesson for Americans and Europeans after 9/11, you can't really crush the ideology. The ideology is there and it's being spread, and there we are.
It is true that that defeating ideas takes longer than defeating physical infrastructure. That is certainly true. I think we have to be very careful not to be defeatist and not to fall into the falsehood that terrorism cannot be defeated. Terrorism can be defeated. And the very existence of the State of Israel, the very fact that it is a creative, thriving human society in the most difficult neighborhood in the world, is living proof that terrorism can be overcome. And that should be an inspiration to the United States. That should be an inspiration to the entire free world. But defeating the ideology of groups like Hamas and Al-Qaeda is something that will take much longer. But we have to be resolute, and we have to be consistent in fighting not only the material elements of these organizations, but the ideological and theological elements that have done so much damage to the beautiful civilization, Islamic civilization, Arab civilization, and are really inflicting tremendous pain on people around the world, primarily Muslims. It is primarily Muslims who pay the price for these murderous ideologies.
It's also always saddened me to think of the fact that Palestinians and Jews are Semitic and have a kind of potential, at least, brotherhood that nevertheless has been so undermined and so, well, I don't want to wax too pessimistic here like you. I want to at least look upon this. It's very difficult, though, because things are very grim right now, and it's difficult to see where the vestiges of hope are going to light. In fact, how long do you think this war is going to last? It's a long, entrenched war, isn't it? It has all the earmarks of that.
Well, it depends on, first of all, what kind of war are we going to have? Is this going to remain contained and confined primarily to a Hamas, PIJ, Israel round of confrontation, as has happened already 5 times in the last decade and a half? Or will this conflict escalate and mutate to include other actors and other fronts? So we still have a lot of uncertainty about that. And we should all be working very, very hard to try to, at the very least, contain this conflict and not have it escalate, and especially not have Hezbollah enter the fray in full force. Because if that does happen, then we're facing an entirely different and much more challenging regional set of circumstances.
Well, what do you see strategically in terms of assistance, not only from the United States, but from the West in general, aside from money? I mean, there's an element of our own legislature now that doesn't want to give more money to Ukraine, and probably that will follow suit with Israel. One can almost predict that. And as I said, we've got a Congress that can't find a speaker in the House of Representatives and has all kinds of impediments in terms of moving forward. So what kind of help is going to be extended here? Or what is the best help other than humanitarian aid, which is necessary on both sides?
Well, I think, first of all, a lot of credit needs to go to the Biden administration. I think they've been doing exactly the right things, certainly over the last week. I'm putting aside the issue of the planned unfreezing of $6 billion to Iran, which my understanding is that there's now a freeze on that unfreezing. But putting that aside, President Biden came out with all the right messages to try to minimize and contain this conflict, specifically a resolute, unequivocal statement in support of Israel's right to defend itself, expressing horror at the carnage and the horrific assaults on civilians, and certainly warning Iran and Hezbollah not to get involved. And the United States has already sent military assets to the Eastern Mediterranean that are supposed to send a very clear signal to Iran and Hezbollah, stay out of this fight. So that is really, really important. The United States, or Israel rather, will need the assistance of the United States to replenish its Iron Dome system, its defensive missile defense system. That is something that Israel will require help with. And then we'll need assistance to stabilize the region and to rebuild. The economic costs are going to be enormous, and not just for Israel, which is a relatively prosperous and powerful economy, but also we need to make sure that we are able to reconstruct conditions of decent living for the Palestinians in Gaza after the war, and we need to make sure that Jordan is stable and that Egypt is stable.
Well, since you mentioned President Biden and speak favorably of the stance that he's taken, I wonder what your thoughts are about former President Trump, who may be the most popular president in Israel that America has ever had. I'm talking about, of course, all of Israel, especially the more conservative elements in Israel, which are very strong in support of President Trump, were and still are. But he comes out and says this would not have happened if he were president. And he said that Ukraine would not have happened if he was president. Now, we know that he can have a lot of hot air and so forth, but one wonders if there's anything to those kind of claims.
Well, the most popular presidents in Israel are presidents like Harry Truman, who 11 minutes after Israel's declaration of independence declared that the United States will recognize and support Israel. Abraham Lincoln is a hero in Israel.
I was thinking in a more contemporary vein, obviously, but you're right. Although Truman now, because of the Oppenheimer movie, I think is being looked at in with a different lens. But we won't go there. You know, let's face it, Trump is very popular in Israel. And what I'm getting at here is Trump's statements to the effect that this would not have happened if he were president. Based on what? You know, I mean, where does he even come up out of whole cloth with a statement of that sort? It's mystifying to me.
Well, I don't know. I think Israelis are grateful to the Trump administration for one main thing, which is to help facilitate breakthroughs, historic breakthroughs in relations with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, and with other countries. That is something that Israelis are very grateful for, and Israelis are also very grateful for the efforts of the Biden administration to try to broker an historic peace deal with Saudi Arabia, and I think that is really the focus at the moment.
Any note of hope in all of this? I mean, you've touched a little bit on it before, that it may lead to a different political changing of the guard and all of that, but what else? Anything else?
I wouldn't be Israeli if I wasn't hopeful. Hope, Hatikva, the hope, is the title of our national anthem. We're a hopeful, resilient people. And I'm also reminded of David Ben Gurion's famous saying that in Israel, if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist.
And what do you say to those who say, if you're an Israeli, you're a colonizer? If you're a Zionist, you're a colonizer? This is a new kind of watchword that seems to be cropping up, particularly on college campuses throughout the United States, and especially on the Eastern Seaboard, but everywhere.
I would say that is a profound misconception born out of a lack of basic historical knowledge. The links between the Jewish people, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel go back for 4,000 years. They precede the rise of Christianity, the rise of Islam. Jews have been praying for Jerusalem and have been pining for a return to their historic homeland for 2,000 years. History bears the idea that if any people on this planet need and deserve a nation state, it's the Jewish people. And from an international legal point of view, it's difficult to find a country around the world, including many countries that we assume to be natural and organic and incontroversial, that have received greater international legal support, legal backing than the State of Israel, including in the League of Nations and in the United Nations. So the ties between the people of Israel, the land of Israel, are incontrovertible. There is that is not to suggest that there's no space in the Holy Land for everybody, for Christians, for Muslims, for Druze, for Circassians, for Jews. We are an incredibly diverse and pluralistic country, and we are made richer in every conceivable way by the fact that Israel is composed of people from every color, every ethnicity, every religion that one can think of. So once the fighting is over, and once you can safely get back on a plane and visit Israel and see it for yourself and experience it for yourself, do it. Israel is not some kind of amorphic symbol. It's a human society with all its glories, all its beauties, and all its challenges. It's no different than any other human society.
A good note for us to conclude on, and thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Michael.
And many thanks to all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And thanks to all who will be listening on Apple and Spotify and on our website at graymatter.show. That's Gray with an E. And if you've not yet joined our vibrant community, Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, do go to our website at graymatter.show and become a member. And thanks to the Gray Matter exceptional team, Alex, Shannon, Colin, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, and Mickey, and to this episode's guest, once again, my gratitude, Amichai Magen. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.